Good afternoon. It's Thursday, the 5th of November, 2024. And yes, this is the U.S. Elections Day. As you may know that people or citizens, eligible citizens across the United States of America are going to engage the ballot box today. So America decides today, and today I'm joined by a very powerful political analyst in his own right, an activist who will be helping me, to unpack the latest developments and analyze what is happening around the U.S. in this crucial time. So you don't want to miss the second day of the USA election special coming to you live from Johannesburg, South Africa. Stay tuned as we will be right back. Welcome back. If you've just joined us, you're watching the U.S. election special on Love World Set. My name is Jackie Shabangu, and I'm joined by the incoming doctor, PhD candidate, and political activist David Kaba, who will be helping us to, analyze the latest developments concerning the ongoing USA elections. So please, we also want to hear from you. If you can, do send us your comments and questions through the Level Set super user, or you can just send us your voice notes or other questions via WhatsApp line, which is probably showing on the screen right now. David, welcome to US Election Special.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for your listeners and viewers. I look forward to a very pertinent discussion.
Amazing. Today US decides. Millions of people in the United States will be, heading to, the ballots. They'll be heading to the polls to decide the future of their nation moving forward. What are your thoughts?
So my thoughts are that this particular election has really, really important ramifications for foreign policy and international relations in particular. 2024 has been the most significant year for global elections, more elections this year than any other year in recorded history. And this is one of those that we have been watching with a very, very expectant eye to see what the global outcome will be. Amazing.
Many have dubbed these elections the most important elections globally, the most contested elections in the history of America, as they say. How would you, characterize these particular elections in the United States?
I think they're definitely characterized by the contention that exists on the right and on the left between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. And I think one of the reasons for this really has to do with the level of the popular vote as a point of discussion in this election. You may recall that there have been previous instances in US history where a candidate has won the popular vote, but has lost in the Electoral College, resulting in a candidate winning more votes overall, but being unable to ascend to the presidency. Hence the importance of swing states as the determining factor in this election. And I think that's one of the most important considerations. We also see that the candidates themselves spend most of their time campaigning in the swing states. 270 votes, that's what you need within the Electoral College to win the election. And that's really where the focus has been.
Yeah. And, the dynamics, obviously, is that of where do most of the votes come from, or where are most of the votes expected to come from. Just bring us up to speed with the basic dynamics of the U.S. Electorate.
Well, I appreciate that, and this is a very good point that you make. So the U.S. electorate is informed by the votes that happen within the Electoral College. When the founding fathers of the nation founded the country, the idea was we need to ensure that we safeguard the votes of the people. And to do so, a system was created called the Electoral College, where each state has a representative number of votes that go towards the Electoral College, and this determines the outcome. In order to win the election, you need 270 votes. The total votes in the Electoral College are 538. Currently, it is predicted that Kamala Harris at this stage of the election has 226 Electoral College votes, while Donald Trump has 219. This is because we have states that are predominantly red and blue, meaning states that always vote Democratic and states that always vote Republican. The determining factor then falls into what we call the swing states, which in an election cycle are called the battleground states. Now, these states are Michigan, which has 15 Electoral College votes, Wisconsin, which has 10 Electoral College votes, Nevada, which has 6, Pennsylvania, which has the largest number within the swing states, 19 Electoral College votes, Georgia, which has 16, Arizona, which has 11, and North Carolina, which has 16. So you will notice in the last 100 days of this election, all of the attention both campaigns have placed has been on contesting within the swing states, because this is where the determining factor will come, predominantly in the state of Pennsylvania. You will notice over the last couple of days, Kamala Harris has had multiple rallies within the state to try and ensure that she gets out that vote. I believe today that Trump has had 2 rallies ongoing in the state, and we see that this has really been the point of contention where the election will be decided.
Yeah, amazing. Many have, argued that the posture of campaigning, or the culture of campaigning in America, is one that we need to adopt in most African countries, as opposed to having political leaders going out to, just recite the manifestos of their respective political parties. They believe that many should go out and be tested, and their thought process be interrogated on the world stage. We have seen that Botswana did that, and the outcome has shocked many hitherto. And also the issue of a vibrantly developed democracy on the continent. What are your thoughts, and should we maybe as a continent or as a country to start with adopt that posture of campaigning?
Good question, and I appreciate that because it's one that's very thoughtful. In South Africa, in 2024, we have had the first election under an amended constitution where the electoral amendment bill was passed. And this speaks to a larger question, to your point. When we compare the system of the US versus the system of what we have in South Africa, we see 2 major differences. That the US has a presidential system and South Africa has a parliamentary system, with the overarching differences being the following. Within a presidential system, you will find that the president is not a member of the legislature, neither is his entire cabinet. So within the US, you have the upper house and the lower house. They also have a bicameral system. Now, the upper chambers and the lower chambers are represented by the Senate and the House of Representatives, respectively. From this is where all of the legislative representatives in America are voted, and then they vote directly for the president, who then appoints his cabinet. And I think their political posturing is very indicative of the system that they have. Within most African states, we adopt the parliamentary system, where it is parliament that serves as a de facto electoral college. We elect parliament, parliament elects the president, and from parliament comes the cabinet in and of itself, with the only exception in the South African context being the president, who presides as the head of state and head of government, and not necessarily a full member of the National Assembly. And I think one of the reasons why we see the differences within the political posturing, if we compare both types of systems, has to do with the question of populism. We have seen a very significant rise in populism globally. Populist leaders who engage in the politics of the personality seem to have a very large appeal, and I think it is indicative of larger questions as to what attracts people to politics, what are the hot button issues, but also what are the kitchen table issues. What you will find is the average person, when you engage them, we each have issues that we are absolutely non-negotiable about. These are issues we would discuss over the kitchen table, hence the name kitchen table issues. You may find that one may disagree with every policy point that a candidate might be espousing, but so long as the kitchen table issues are finding alignment, that vote would be reflected towards that particular candidate. It is for this reason that, in my view, it is not a necessity in our system to adopt the same kind of political posturing that we see within the US. But in light of the Electoral Amendment Bill, I do think that a systemic change is required for a more direct representation of democracy as far as voting for our head of state and head of government is concerned.
Yeah, you term it very nicely, the kitchen table approach, where the eligible voter would, would find themselves being led to, run with the one who speaks to the kitchen requirements. and I've always raised a concern about this, because in my understanding it's that democracy becomes a bit compromised when we engage the citizens largely on kitchen table issues. Whilst it is important for the government to do its part, especially, or rather in particular, for those who cannot attend to their kitchen issues through social welfare, whatever it takes, that, in my understanding, has proven not to be sustainable. That's my observation. If anything, it's an unsustainable burden to the fiscus. But also, it also just consolidates a culture, a mentality, which, just makes people lazy, for lack of a better word. We've seen in South Africa that a lot of political parties, especially the ruling government, has always capitalized on the kitchen deficits, to lure the electorate in that direction. One may argue that, of course, that was right, that was appealing, but they failed decimally to can even, speak to the needs of 50% of those who are in need in that regard, because governments were not actually designed to can take care of that. It's unsustainable for a lot of governments, especially in Africa, to can sustainably run government on social welfare. You cannot run a country on social welfare. It's very unsustainable. If 90% of the people or 80% of the population depends on you as the government, and you want to rely on the taxes to can, cater or meet their needs, then you are running a risk of being compromised, because also you find yourself compromising your reputation on account of you wanting to discharge a mandate that is inherently not yours, and the system does not enable you to can discharge that mandate to a very large extent. So the kitchen top approach for me, especially in the side of the world, has been a very great concern. And it also insinuates to some of us that civic education has not taken place the way it needs to, because we are not having, we do not go to, we don't engage the ballot from the premise of political ideology, but we engage the ballot from a populist and a kitchen deficit premise, of which for me it's a very great risk. What are your thoughts really concerning that, in light of what is happening in South Africa especially?
That's a really good question, and I share the concern on the ongoing rise that we see in populism. And what we've seen reflected in most of the elections this year is that the most popular candidates are those who engage in populism. Single issue campaigns, where many arguments have been made that in light of what is happening, they are not very substantive. And what you will find is they tend to be very popular because they exclude a lot of the underlying factors that are important to take into account when developing policy. And I'll draw an American example and then bring it back home. So one of the most popular economic policies that Trump is pushing is the notion of tariffs. And he's very big on arguing that tariffs are a necessity, they are required, and this is one of the ways that America will be made great again, particularly in light of bilateral conversations, discussions, and relationships that it has been an unfair kind of engagement where the US has been putting in more than it has been receiving. And this is the argument that has been made. However, in implementing a tariff, what you will find is that it will actually result in a deficit from a pure economics perspective. The reason being, when you impose tariffs, those who are within the state will end up having to pay more for goods and services, and in particular imports that are coming. And for those who are buying local, you will find there is an increase of costs as well, because on the producer side, they now have to pay more to import the means of production when trying to ensure that they meet the supply and the demand that they must engage in. Then we have Kamala Harris, who is very much engaging in an extension of what has been referred to as Bidenomics. You may have seen that after COVID, most economies globally went into a recession. However, the government in the US increased spending to ensure that although there was a global recession that was taking place, that this did not meet the taxpayer directly. However, this spending itself also has inflationary effect, hence the prices that we see in the US currently. Now, if we bring this to a South African perspective, I think what is very important to take into account about looking at single issues in engaging within the electorate is the lack of voter education that we have had. I have been on the campaign trail myself in many spaces, and I have seen this firsthand. And what then becomes important is to ensure that we meet people at the point of their need, but also engage in a way that increases understanding. I like the point that you made about civic education. It's a very important consideration to take into account. I like the point that you made about considering what in our context might actually work for our economic model. It is a very unwise approach to copy and paste what has worked elsewhere without taking into account the full factors that we see within our system. And it is for this reason, you mentioned ideology. I myself am of the persuasion of a social democrat. So my political ideology has very much been that there should be state intervention, but state intervention done in a responsible way. A system is a system is a system. A system will function the way the system was designed to function. Absolutely. And therefore, we must ensure that those running the system are very well capacitated to do their job, hence the importance of elections.
Amazing. We are going to be talking briefly about the impact of the past governments, the performance, how they're fed relatively from one another, but also what do you think should be the engagements or the posture of engagement between Africa and the United States moving forward. That we'll do after the break. Please stay tuned as we bring you more updates and analysis on the US elections.
Hello, beautiful, beautiful North Carolina. Thank you. Hello, beautiful, beautiful North Carolina. But it's ours to lose. Does that make sense to you? It's ours to lose. If we get everybody out and vote, there's not a thing they can do. And if we don't, they have to get every person that ever signed anything in that horrendously dangerous party that's going to destroy our country. And it already is destroying our country. We just can't let that happen. We cannot let that happen. So here's my only purpose in even being here today. Get out and vote. You know that. And the reason I delayed that, you're the first ones I've told it to. Congratulations, North Carolina.
We're ready to get out the vote. We're ready to win. But what you all are signing up to do today and what you've been doing, like, let's enjoy it. You know, and I know you do. I can feel the mood in here because it's the best of who we are as a democracy. And I think we've kind of, right? And that's what our campaign has been about. We are a people-driven campaign. And we love the people. And we see in the face of a stranger a neighbor, right? And that's the spirit of what we are doing. And over these last, this whole era of this other guy, what it's done with all that talk that's been about trying to have us point fingers at each other and divide each other, it makes people feel alone. It makes them feel like there's nobody standing with them. And so the way I've always been thinking about our campaign in these next 24 hours is, as we are getting out the vote, as we are canvassing, let's be intentional about building community, about building coalitions, about reminding people we all have so much more in common than what separates us. There is power in that. There is power in that. Let's vote. Let's get out the 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 vote. Let's win.
Welcome back. You are watching the U.S. election special on Love Well Set, and we continue to analyze the latest developments surrounding the U.S. elections happening at this moment. I hope you've been sending us your questions and comments on our Love Well Set super user account and other platforms, or the social, King's Chat, super user of Beyond the Ballot or Talking Solutions. The numbers are probably showing on your screen right now. Would like to hear from you. So just before the break, we were just analyzing the state of affairs in the country, but also bringing it into the context of what we're going through here, and trying to gauge if it's feasible for us to can maybe, for lack of a better word, copy what is happening that side and bring it into our country, so that, in a manner rather, that would find relevant and meaningful expression. But what I want us to do now is to just attempt to, look into the performance of the respective government leaders in the United States from the time of Barack Obama till now with President Joe Biden. How can you briefly summarize or characterize that which has happened in America with the respective governments from the time of Barack Obama hitherto?
Right, I appreciate that, and it's another really good question. And when we look at each presidential term and tenure, what we see is that it is defined by the policy platforms that each candidate was able to successfully implement. Candidates run on a platform, they make a series of policy promises, and we then gauge their effectiveness in carrying those policies out to determine how well they have done, but also the impact and influence that they have had. When we look at Obama, his kind of landmark policy approach has been that of Obamacare through the Affordable Care Act. And this is because within the US, what we find is that healthcare has very much been a concern for many citizens. They have one of the highest healthcare rates in the world. Obama managed to get through a bipartisan bill. Although it was not in the format he had initially envisioned, this was considered to be the greatest success of his presidency, but also opening up American interests in various states around the world. Obama received a Nobel Prize very, very early within his presidency for his efforts within diplomacy, and that's very much how I would define that. Domestically, it has been the Affordable Care Act. Internationally, there's been engagements with different actors. When we look at Trump has very much been marked by what we in the political sciences refer to as mercantilism. Now, mercantilism is essentially what we see through the America First movement, the understanding that we must put the country first. We must ensure that we prioritize citizens. We must ensure that all of our actions are meant to benefit the American people, and if they do not benefit the American people, we should pull out of any such agreement. And this we had seen also affect his foreign policy approaches. His engagements with NATO, tariffs that were placed on Canada and China as well, very much reflect the notion of an America First policy. When we look at Joe Biden, his greatest success is considered to be the Inflation Reduction Act. And this particular act went on to have a very wide-reaching series of successes. It created over 4 million jobs. It resulted in bridges being built, in railway connections, in internet connectivity being improved. And what we see reflected within his approach to foreign policy has very much been demonstrating American might on the international stage. We see this in the support given to the Ukraine against Russia. We also see this in the support given to Israel against Palestine. Now, watching the development of all three of these particular governments, the one thing that is very evident has been that their policy approaches tend to influence the mood within the state. And I think when we look at Harris and we look at Trump in this election, we see a further extension of that.
Yeah, very interesting. You made mention some of the glaring socioeconomic vicissitudes that the nation or the people of the nation, of the nations in America, are, finding themselves having to contend with on a day-to-day basis, and those who are on the other side of the world are still deceived to think that it's all gloom and good to be in the U.S. You go there and you have it lavish, but research and many conversations with those who are settled to that side has really cited that we almost have the same issues, especially where the poor of the poorest are concerned. Housing issues, housing deficit remains the issue. The unattainable cost of living for many also remains an issue. What are some of the teething issues that you have observed, and who do you think with the two contestants speaks better to those issues sustainably?
That's a really good question as well. And I must say, when we bring in the question of sustainability, we see that the biggest economic issue, in my view, that American citizens are facing has been the inflation that they are engaging upon, but also their ability or inability to engage in the economy with some level of disposable income. For example, in South Africa in this election, you have seen that very many political parties have some form of universal basic income to speak to the question of disposable income. Now, when we look at Trump and Harris's economic policies in particular, what we find is that the economics of the discussions that are had are indicative of broader social questions. So it seems to be the case that the emphasis has been placed more on the social influence of their economic policies than on the actual economic policies. Now, when we look at the differences, Kamala Harris has been referred to as the border czar, given the fact that the mandate given to her by President Biden has been to engage on the causal factors that have resulted in the high rates of immigrants trying to get into the U.S., and this is primarily coming from South America, states such as Honduras. The economic factors and the social and lived experiences there have resulted in a high rate of immigrants trying to enter into the U.S. The Biden administration has been regarded as very, very open towards receiving these immigrants, which has also caused a number of critiques and criticisms, as there is a belief that the growing rate of immigration is causing a very negative impact on the economy, in particular American citizens. Then we compare this to Trump, and as we spoke about previously, his great emphasis placed on tariffs is indicative of Trumponomics, which also has elements of trickle-down economics, the idea and belief that if you can ensure that the top percent are well taken care of and are able to participate in the economy, that this will trickle down and affect the ordinary American citizen. At this stage, I believe that it is a bit difficult to identify which economic policy would be more feasible. Reason being that Kamala Harris has simply carried out the mandate given to her by Bidenomics, and we are yet to see what a Trump approach to economics would look like in a post-COVID era. Will it be reminiscent of Reaganomics or Thatcherism, or will it have a greater sense of applicability within our current body politic?
Amazing. Very interesting analysis that you have just given there. We are yet to see. But I think those who are in the United States, the electorate there remains the best decision-making structure at this point, for lack of a better word. That's the best. That's the constituency, yeah, that is best suited right now to can make the right decisions. I think they do, to a large extent, know who speaks better to their needs as things stand. But you kept on bringing up the issue of the private sector. And in my previous discussion during the Botswana elections, I had to attempt to interrogate briefly the power, or rather the influence of business or the private sector in a democracy, especially the outcome of elections and what happens beyond the ballots. We've seen in South Africa that the influence or the role of the private sector is quite inevitable. They remain having their hands there, and often more than not, they remain having their preferences emerging either way, whether through personalities or reforms in policy, first and foremost. What are your thoughts in that regard where the US is concerned? Is the private sector still deciding the tune, or is it the people, is it the ordinary of the ordinaries?
So that's a very interesting debate that you do bring up, and it is very hotly contested and debated as a topic of discussion within the United States. The election machinery within the US very much functions like what you would see within the private sector. It is very kind of corporate structured within the various states. You have these satellite offices, you have volunteers, you have executive teams, and you have super PACs, which are very much supported and rooted in the interest of various interest groups. Recent polls have been released, and data has been provided to indicate who some of the respective candidates' largest supporters are. And we have seen Elon Musk provide a lot of support to Donald Trump financially as well, and we see that also reflected within the Tesla fiscus. We've seen Google provide a lot of financial support to Kamala Harris. Now, when we see how this affects the private sector, the US economy is very much based on a capitalist approach with very heavy elements of neoliberalism. And because it is neoliberal in nature, what we find is that the private sector continues to play a very large role. Now, particularly in the advent of the Electoral College, it has been argued that the nature, the format, and the makeup of the Electoral College is of such a manner that it does affect the voting delegates, and these voting delegates are make the decisions informed by the lived experiences that they have, the mandates that they receive from their respective states, and those mandates are often informed by what we see happening within the private sector. Now, the biggest differences that we see within the US is that the approach to the private sector is very much dependent on the question of class. Trump, as we mentioned, exhibits many elements of trickle-down economics, which is the view and the belief that if the top percentage of earners are able to engage in the economy, if they have lower taxes, they can better participate. If they can better participate, they can create more jobs. And if they can create more jobs, it means the economy is doing better. What you'll find is this will result in an increase in the GDP, as it has in Trump's first term, but the Gini coefficient remains very much the same. Within the Harris administration, there is a saying that the rich must pay their fair share, which is a view that those who are wealthier and the larger corporates should pay a larger share of taxes in order to benefit the general populace. And these are the two different approaches that we have seen within the private sector in the US. So the question then becomes, do voters vote based on their lived experiences? Do they vote based on the ideology? Do they vote based on their money in their pocket? Because although it has been argued that trickle-down economics does not benefit the ordinary man, Trump's largest base of supporters continue to be those within the more developing and rural communities within the US versus Harris, who tends to find greater support within more urbanized spaces. And this often begs a question of classism as it pertains to the private sector. And I think the results of the Electoral College in this particular election will give us an indication of what the voters' view of the private sector in the election gives a clear indication of.
Yeah, yeah, and it's very interesting now the dynamics that are at play now, because there is a serious glaring opportunity cost that is poised to the private sector, given the business acumen and the reputation of Donald Trump versus Kamala Harris, where, like I said, in business is concerned. And many would argue that, while uncaptured, business would prefer Trump as the candidate. But because systems are always captured by your elites and globalists, the others might find relevant expression to can circumvent the prospects of the other, because what their interest at this point is who will be a pliable conduits of their agenda, of which also would, that in my understanding would be one of the very critical determining factors of this year's elections. The outcome of these elections will also be determined by who is, in my view, capturable by the capitalist. But the place of America in as far as Africa is concerned, the trade relations, it has been cited by many that trade between America and African countries has declined, though there is some consolidation that is invariably refined where the AGOA signatories are concerned. What are your thoughts about that? How should Africa continue to engage with the United States post these elections, in view also of the Africa Vision 2063?
I sincerely appreciate that, and once again, it's a very, very good question that I think all of us on the continent should give great consideration to. When we look at the dynamics in Africa, I think one of the most important developments that we have from a trade perspective is the African Free Continental Trade Area. Globally, what we see is a lot of our interactions still occur through the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. In many African states, we have seen the brunt of structural adjustment programs that have been imposed, where the net benefit has not resulted in any improvement in the lived experiences of many Africans, but also has resulted in a sense of dependency that many African states are trying to distance themselves from, hence, as you've mentioned, a decline. But although there has been a decline, there remains the fact that the U.S. remains one of the largest trading partners that many African states have. It is therefore important to maintain a collegial relationship, but not a relationship that is rooted in the notion of dependency. Therefore, I am grateful to see the assertiveness that many African states and leaders have displayed on the international stage. And so long as that assertiveness remains rooted in collegiality and global and sustainable development, I think it can bode well. Therefore, my view is that the posture as it pertains to the United States must be one of friendly cooperation, but not an imposition of any influences on our domestic policy, but also our interactions with other states on the global stage. Simply because one state has enemies with another state does not automatically mean that allies are meant to adopt that same state as enemies as well. We remain signatories in various spaces, such as the United Nations, and we see the discussions that are happening within the Security Council, and these then trickle down to the discussions that affect things such as trade. During COVID, we had also seen the questions of intellectual property as it pertains to vaccine development, distribution, but also ownership, where many vaccines were produced in Africa, but Africans did not have access to them until much later on in their development, is highly, highly problematic. And those are the kinds of instances that should be avoided. So friendly relations are very important, are encouraged based on collegiality without the notion of dependency.
Without the notion of dependency. And yesterday, my guest was citing that there is no political will to that effect on the continent, much as many would argue otherwise, in particular those who are benefiting from the current status quo in that regard. How do we deal with the issue of our leaders continuously, circumventing the prospects of growth in the nation? Many would refer to that practice as a sellout practice, because it's like every time they go around the four corners of the table, what matters at that point, it's solely their personal interests more than the electorate mandate. How do we, especially African countries such as South Africa with a vibrant democracy, arguably, leverage the democratic process to can thwart these practices moving forward? We saw Botswana recently in these elections. They made their voices heard, and they were very clear. They're not lukewarm. They're very clear. The output of these elections in Botswana was giving a hot temperature output kind of a thing. So how should we be taking advantage of the democratic process, including the public participation process, where the law-making process is concerned, to can intercept such?
That's a very good question, and I'm enjoying all of these. It's a very interesting example when we look at what happened in Botswana, where the ruling regime for over nearly 6 decades, is no longer in the seat of governance. And one can argue that a similar situation is what has been unfolding in South Africa, where since the dawn of our democracy, our liberation movement is not holding the lion's share to the extent where they've been able to independently form a government. Many have argued this is an indication of democracy at play, an indication that the democracy is vibrant and it is working. However, then we look at elements such as voter apathy and low voter turnout. We consider the fact that in this election, voter turnout did not breach the 60% mark. And what we see is that participation begins occurring in other avenues, platforms, and spaces, and not necessarily at the ballot box. I have always maintained the view that there are four kinds of activists that we see. There is the disruptor, those who march in the streets and raise issues. There is the active citizen who mobilizes towards change. There is the change maker who identifies issues and solutions. And there is the reformer, those elected representatives who sit and represent us in spaces. And there needs to be a better sense of alignment between all four of these actors, because ultimately it is within these four spaces where we see the democratic process unfold. And it is also my view that within this kind of engagement, we can see a decline in voter apathy and an uptake in democratic participation. And this is not only reflective in South Africa, I think across the continent and even internationally, it then becomes important to leverage the democratic processes that we have, particularly, as you've mentioned, within the space of public participation. In the South African context, we have a coalition government, one that I think uniquely allows us to engage government in a more direct way than we have before, because now we have multiple options, avenues, and platforms. Therefore, the public participation process becomes one that is critical and crucial, but it must also be rooted in an informed citizenry, and public participation goes hand in hand with civic education to make this a reality.
Amazing. We are sadly out of time. I would have wanted us to engage further, particularly on the issues of youth participation in the electorate and how they can be leveraged as a strategic avenue in, you know, providing the needful impetus and as far as the desired outcome is concerned. But like I said, time is not on our side. So till the next special episode happening tomorrow of the US election special, stay blessed and stay tuned to Love Well Set.